The ceiling fan hummed above me slow, tired, uneven like it was remembering too much. Morning light stretched across the kitchen table, catching the edge of the cream stationery I'd laid out. The ink bottle sat beside my hand, still capped. I'd been staring at the envelopes for nearly an hour. They said weddings were supposed to be joyful, but no one told me how heavy joy could feel when it arrived too late. I started with the easy names first. The florist, my old friend Ruth from the book club, even the woman from the bakery who always saved me the last almond croissant. Their names came easily, neat and round, like they belonged to a simpler life. Then I reached the two names that didn't. Claire, Matthew. My hand froze. The pen tip hovered over the paper, trembling slightly. It's strange how your own children can start to feel like strangers once the years pile up between you. I'd told myself that maybe time would soften them, that the anger would fade once they built lives of their own. But when I looked at those blank envelopes, I felt the same quiet distance that had settled between us 20 years ago. I whispered their names anyway, just to hear how they sounded out loud. The house stayed silent, as if it was listening. The kettle clicked behind me. I stood, poured the tea, and watched the steam rise, curling like old memories. Jasmine, my favorite. Peter always said it smelled like peace, but I didn't think he knew how rare peace really was in this house. When I sat back down, I thought about Peter's handwriting, the way he'd written my name when he asked me to marry him. The card had been tucked inside a book, Collected Poems of Mary Oliver. He'd underlined one line in pencil: "You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves." Maybe that was what I was doing, loving what I loved. Even if it made others turn away. I uncapped the pen. The ink bled smoothly onto the paper, dark and deliberate. Miss Claire Hart, Mr. Matthew Hart. I hesitated before the words, and guessed. Somehow it felt too hopeful. Too formal, like pretending we still shared the kind of closeness that invited others in. I left it out. The ceiling fan ticked again. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed and a dog barked. Life went on, indifferent and ordinary. I sealed each envelope with care, pressing my thumb against the flap like it might leave behind something human: warmth, forgiveness, a mother's scent, anything that could travel through the mail unseen. But even as I stacked them neatly beside the others, my stomach tightened. I knew how this would go. Claire would open it, see my name, and set it aside. Matthew might not open it at all. Still, I whispered to the empty kitchen, "Let's see who loves me enough to show up." The wind pushed against the window just then, a hollow rattle that sounded almost like laughter. I almost smiled. Almost. I thought about the last time all of us had sat around a table together. It had been my birthday 6 years ago, maybe 7. Claire brought a cake, lemon curd, and vanilla, my favorite. But she hadn't looked at me while she served it. Matthew had barely said 2 words the whole evening. When I'd tried to ask what was wrong, they both told me, almost in unison, "We don't want to talk about the past." But the past was the only thing that ever wanted to talk to me. The morning light shifted thinner now, more fragile. I traced the edge of one invitation with my fingertip, feeling the texture of the paper. It reminded me of old skin, soft, wrinkled, still trying to hold meaning. For a moment I considered throwing them out. Maybe it was kinder that way, to save us all the disappointment. But love, I've learned, isn't always about what's kind. Sometimes it's just about trying, even when you know it won't change a thing. I placed the envelopes into a small wicker basket and carried them to the counter by the door. Tomorrow I'd walk them to the post office, past the diner that still served burnt coffee, past the seawall where Peter liked to watch the waves. He didn't understand the weight of this. How could he? His children still called, still visited, still told him they loved him. When I'd told him mine weren't coming around much, he'd only said, "They'll come when they're ready." But what if they never were? I sat back down, the chair creaking softly under me. My hands smelled faintly of ink and tea. I pressed them together and closed my eyes. I could almost see their faces as children: Claire with her scraped knees and too big sweater, Matthew with his quiet stubbornness. I used to think I'd always know them. But grief changes a person's shape, and sometimes it changes the way their children see them too. Outside, the wind picked up. The curtain by the sink lifted like a sigh. I thought of Alan, then my ex-husband, their father. We hadn't spoken in years. Our marriage ended quietly, like a candle running out of wax. One moment there was light, and then there wasn't. I wondered if he'd tell them to come. I doubted it. He was never good at choosing sides, or maybe he just didn't want to. The clock on the wall clicked toward noon. I stood, gathered the teacup, and rinsed it under cool water. The sound of the tap filled the silence for a moment. A small mercy. Before I turned away, I glanced one last time at the basket on the counter, the neat stack of invitations waiting to be sent. They looked harmless, almost hopeful, like little prayers wrapped in paper. I wanted to believe that sending them meant something, that maybe, somewhere beneath all the years of silence, my children would remember the sound of my voice reading them bedtime stories, or the way I'd braid Claire's hair before school, or how Matthew would hold my hand when he was scared of thunder. But love doesn't erase what came after. It only coexists with it. I turned off the lights and walked toward the hallway. The house followed me with its familiar creaks, the kind that say, "You've been here too long." Just before I closed the door behind me, I whispered again, softer this time, "Let's see who loves me enough to show up." The wind answered, gentle but insistent, brushing against the window like fingertips against glass, and for the first time in years, I couldn't tell if it was warning me or wishing me luck. The mail slot stayed quiet that week. No replies, no small white envelopes in return. Just the sigh of the wind slipping through the cracks of the front door and the creak of the old floorboards beneath my steps. Each morning I checked the mailbox, pretending it was routine, just another errand, but my heart always stumbled a little before I lifted the lid. Empty, again. By the fourth day, I stopped pretending. The kettle whistled louder than usual that morning, like it was trying to fill the silence that had settled in the house. I poured my tea, watched the steam rise, and thought about Claire's face when she was 12, the way she'd turn red when she was angry, her chin trembling but her voice steady. She'd gotten that from me. The stubbornness, the need to be right. I had loved her for it then. Now it was the wall between us. Peter tried to make light of it. "They'll come around, Evie," he said over dinner, his fork tapping gently against the plate. "You know how kids are. Time softens things." But time hadn't softened anything, it had only polished the distance between us. Made it smoother, easier to live with, until I mistook that distance for peace. I nodded anyway, because Peter didn't deserve the sharp edges of my disappointment. He'd never met the version of me who used to shout across rooms or slam cabinet doors. He only knew the woman who found comfort in quiet mornings and second chances. That night, when he fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the faint light leaking through the curtains. The air smelled faintly of rain, the kind that never quite arrives. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, an old habit. Though I knew what I'd find. I opened the photo gallery. The first picture was of the beach near our home, smooth sand, footprints, horizon fading into mist. Then came the older ones, the ones I should have deleted long ago. Claire in her college dorm, smiling for the camera but not at me. Matthew at his wedding, his new wife's hand looped through his arm. I'd been there, sitting in the second row, smiling so hard my face hurt. He hadn't looked my way once. I scrolled until the photos blurred into light, my thumb trembling slightly. Sometimes, when you've lived long enough, silence becomes its own kind of noise. I set the phone down, closed my eyes, and tried to remember the sound of their laughter when they were small, how it filled the house, bouncing off the walls even after Alan left. Alan. His name drifted into my mind like smoke, unexpected, unwanted, but familiar. We hadn't spoken in years. The last time it had been about money. Before that, about the children. Before that, about nothing at all. The phone rang then. I startled, it was past midnight. For a moment I thought maybe, impossibly, it was Claire. Maybe she'd seen the invitation, softened, decided to call. My hands trembled as I reached for the phone, but the name on the screen stopped me cold. Alan Hart. I let it ring once, twice. The third time, I answered. His voice came through soft, rasped by age, but still carrying that calm certainty that once both anchored and irritated me. "Evelyn." I didn't know what to say. The years between us sat heavy in the silence. "I got your invitation," he said. My throat tightened. "I didn't send you one." "I know." He paused, and I could almost hear the faint smile in his voice. "Ruth called. She told me. Said you were getting married by the sea. People talk too much," I murmured. "They always did." Another pause. I could hear him breathing, slow and steady. It struck me how strange it was to recognize a person by their silences, as much as their words. "I'm happy for you," he said finally. Truly. I didn't believe him, not fully, but there was something softer in his tone, a gentleness I didn't remember from our years together. Maybe time had humbled him too. "Do they know?" he asked quietly. I hesitated. "About the wedding?" "No," he said. "That I'm coming." The words landed slowly, like pebbles dropped into still water. "You're coming?" I repeated. "If you'll let me." I stood there in the half-dark, staring at the reflection of the phone light against the window pane. Rain had finally started to fall, slow and uncertain. I watched a droplet slide down the glass, catching the faint orange glow of the streetlight outside. "Why now?" I asked. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "Maybe because I should have come a long time ago." The sound of rain filled the space between us. I wanted to ask him what he meant, what he thought he could fix by showing up. But something in his voice stopped me. It wasn't pride anymore, or guilt. It was regret, plain and quiet. "I'm not sure they'll like that," I said. "Claire and Matthew. I didn't expect they would." "Then why?" "Because you shouldn't have to walk alone," he said softly. "Not this time." My chest tightened. He said he'd call again before the wedding. Then the line went quiet. I stood there long after the call ended, the phone still pressed to my ear, the dial tone fading into nothing. Peter stirred in the bedroom, murmured my name in his sleep. I turned off the light and stood by the window for a long while, watching the rain trace slow paths down the glass. It had been years since I'd heard Alan's voice, yet it lingered in the air like a familiar scent, impossible to ignore. The kind that pulls you back to a version of yourself you thought you'd outgrown. Somewhere in that quiet, I thought about what he'd asked. "Do they know I'm coming?" And for the first time, I realized what he really meant. It wasn't a question about them. It was a question about me. Would I let the past walk beside me even for a moment on the day I was finally trying to move forward? The rain fell harder outside. The air smelled of wet earth and salt. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew that when the phone rang again, whoever it was, I would answer. Because silence, no matter how familiar, was beginning to feel too much like loneliness. The road to Sycamore Lane was narrower than I remembered. Trees leaned closer now. Branches knotted together like gossiping neighbors. I hadn't been down this way in more than a decade, but my hands found the turns without thinking, like the memory of home lived somewhere in my bones. The air smelled of rain and cut grass. I rolled the window down, letting the wind tangle my hair. Each corner brought a flicker of the past. The park where Matthew learned to ride his bike. The bakery where Claire used to spend her allowance on lemon tarts. The stop sign where Alan and I once kissed during a red light, laughing like we still believed in forever. Then the house came into view. For a moment, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. The siding was pale blue now, not the soft yellow Alan and I had painted one summer when the kids were small. The old willow tree in the front yard was gone, replaced by a trimmed hedge and a neat row of tulips. Even the mailbox had changed, no longer the one Matthew had painted with crooked red hearts. I slowed the car and pulled to the curb. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. I sat there, hands resting on the wheel, staring at what used to be ours. The front curtains fluttered. A woman passed by the window, her hair pulled back, her arms full of laundry. Somewhere deeper inside, a man laughed, the sound faint but unmistakable. A child's voice followed, high and happy, calling for someone named Mom. I should have driven away, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, the years folding over themselves. The laughter spilling from that house didn't belong to me anymore, but the walls remembered I could feel it. The porch boards we'd replaced together. The front steps Alan swore he'd fix every spring and never did. They were all still there, even if everything else had changed. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, the scene rewound. The house returned to its old yellow, sunlight spilling across the lawn. Claire was at the kitchen window, her hair sticking to her face as she washed dishes. Matthew sat on the porch, drawing circles in the dust with a stick. Alan was inside, the radio playing Sinatra too loud. It was the night everything fell apart. Claire had been 17, furious, beautiful in that way only teenagers can be when they're breaking. I can still hear her voice shaking but strong. "You chose him over us, Mom." She'd slammed the door so hard the frame cracked. The sound had followed me for years through every apartment, every lonely night. I opened my eyes. The house was blue again. The laughter inside was someone else's. A part of me wanted to knock on the door, to tell the woman who lived there that this used to be the place where my family came undone. But what would that change? She'd only smile politely, maybe offer me a kind word, then close the door and go back to her life. People move on. Houses, too. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. The gold ring Peter had given me caught the light small, simple, honest. But all I could think about was the other ring I'd worn for 22 years before it was slipped off and dropped into a drawer. I wondered if Alan ever thought about that day, the silence that followed, the way he didn't chase me when I left. The sun was lowering now, streaks of amber running through the trees. I watched as the family inside the house gathered near the window. The father lifted the child onto his shoulders. The little boy's laughter carried through the glass, through the years, right into me. It's strange, the way pain softens when you see it living in someone else's joy. I wasn't angry, just hollow in a way that didn't hurt anymore. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an old Polaroid. It was faded, the colors bleached by time. The four of us stood in front of that same porch, the willow tree behind us. Claire's hair was in pigtails. Matthew was missing a front tooth. Alan's arm was around my waist, his smile easy and unguarded. I touched the edge of the photograph. The paper was worn smooth from years of keeping it close, then putting it away, then taking it out again when the loneliness grew too loud. In the rearview mirror, the sky turned the color of old bruises purple, gray, soft gold, the kind of light that makes everything look gentler than it really is. I should have driven home. Peter would be setting the table, waiting for me to bring the good news that the invitations had been mailed, that I felt lighter somehow. I should have gone back to that future, but instead, I stayed in the past, parked on a street that no longer belonged to me. The laughter inside the house quieted. Someone drew the curtains. The porch light flicked on. I sat there until the first stars appeared small, hesitant. My tea thermos had gone cold beside me. The car smelled faintly of rain and paper. Love, I thought, was never about belonging. It was about witnessing the people we've been, the choices we've made, the places we can't return to. I started the engine, but my hand lingered on the key. The dashboard lights flickered to life, washing my face in pale blue. I took one last look at the house, the soft glow behind the curtains, the sound of a distant lullaby drifting through the window. For a moment, I let myself imagine it was Claire humming, that she'd grown into the kind of mother who could forgive, that she'd tuck her child into bed with a story I once told her about stars and promises and how love, even when it breaks, always leaves a trace. But imagination is a cruel kind of mercy. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away slowly. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, shrinking until it was just a blue shadow against the night. Halfway down the street, I caught my reflection in the mirror, a woman with silver hair, tired eyes, and a quiet resolve. I whispered to her, like a secret, maybe love isn't meant to heal. Maybe it's just meant to remind us where it still hurts. The tires hummed softly against the road as I drove back toward the coast. Behind me, the porch light of the blue house stayed on, warm and steady, as if the past was still watching, still waiting, but finally willing to let me go. The night was heavy with rain. It came down in thin, tired sheets that blurred the world outside my window. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in the cardigan I'd worn all day, the one with loose threads at the sleeves. Peter had fallen asleep hours ago, his breathing steady, untroubled, but I couldn't close my eyes. Not tonight. Something about the house on Sycamore Lane had followed me home, the color of the walls, the laughter through the glass, the ghost of what used to be. I thought I'd left it there on that quiet street. But memory has its own kind of gravity. It pulls you back when you least expect it. So I got up, turned on the lamp, and reached under the bed. The wooden box was still there, old cedar, its corners soft with age. I hadn't touched it in years. Dust clung to its lid, the faint smell of smoke and lavender rising as I pulled it out. My name was carved into the top, unevenly, by Alan's hand the summer we moved into our first house. I remembered the day he gave it to me. For your keepsakes, he'd said, so you don't lose the things that matter. Funny. Most of what mattered I'd managed to lose anyway. I hesitated before opening it. The lock had long since rusted, so I pressed my thumb to the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, time sat still. A few dried rose petals. A seashell Claire had painted blue. A faded photograph of Alan in the garden, squinting at the sun. And beneath it all, a small bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with string. I knew what they were. I'd known for years. Letters from Alan written after the divorce, delivered but never opened. I'd kept them out of something I mistook for strength. Maybe I thought that if I never read his words, they couldn't hurt me. Or maybe I was afraid that they still could. My hands shook as I untied the string. The first envelope was dated 3 months after I left. The ink was smudged, the corner torn. Inside was a letter written in his familiar, slanted hand, the kind that always leaned too far forward, like he was racing against his own thoughts. Eve, I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because the silence between us is louder than any fight we ever had. I keep walking through the house, touching things that still have your fingerprints on them. The kettle, the quilt, the place on the wall where the clock used to hang. I can't bring myself to fix the hole where you took it down. I never hated you. I hated how small I felt beside you. You always seemed to know who you were even when you were lost. I didn't. I still don't. I hope the kids are kind to you. I know I wasn't. I read it once. Then again. The words sank slowly, heavy and quiet, like stones dropped into deep water. Alan had never been the kind of man to apologize. His silence was his armor, and for years I mistook it for cruelty. But here in his uneven handwriting, I saw something else, a man stripped bare of pride, afraid not of losing me, but of admitting he already had. I took a long breath, tracing the lines of ink with my fingertip. It's strange how letters hold a different kind of truth than speech. People write what they can't say aloud, as if paper can forgive what memory won't. I opened another envelope. This one dated 2 years later. I heard Claire started at the university. You would have been proud. She's got your stubbornness. I think she still hates me, but that's all right. It's honest. Sometimes I walk past the old cafe by the lake. I keep expecting to see you there, reading the paper, pretending not to notice when I walk in. If I ever do, I think I'll just sit across from you and not say a word. Maybe that would be enough. A. The rain outside deepened, a steady rhythm against the windows. I wiped my cheek before realizing I was crying. The tears weren't sharp, just quiet, the kind that arrive when grief has grown gentle with age. Alan's words filled the small room, rearranging the silence I'd built around myself. I thought about Peter sleeping down the hall kind, patient Peter, who loved me without needing to fix anything. He deserved the woman I was now, but reading Alan's letters, I felt the shadow of the woman I used to be, brittle, proud, and endlessly trying to hold her life together with both hands. I opened one last letter, the final in the stack. The paper was thinner, the writing shakier. Eve, I don't know if this will reach you. I heard from Matthew that you moved closer to the sea. That sounds right. You always needed the horizon. I've been sick. Nothing serious, they say, but I've learned to measure my days in smaller moments. The sound of the wind through the willow tree, the smell of coffee in the morning, the memory of your laughter in the dark. I wish I'd listened more when you spoke. I wish I'd told you I was proud of you, not for staying, but for leaving. You were never mine to keep, Eve. I just hope, wherever you are, you've forgiven me for trying. Alan. I folded the letter slowly, pressing my palm against it. The words blurred as my eyes stung again. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, low, distant, like something remembering itself. For the first time in years, I whispered his name aloud. Alan. It hung in the air like a prayer, or maybe a farewell. I sat there for a long while, surrounded by his letters and the faint smell of rain-soaked wood. Each page was a piece of him I'd refused to see, the tenderness, the regret, the quiet love that had survived the wreckage. And yet, I couldn't shake the question that lingered like smoke. Why now? Why reach out when I'd finally built a life without him? I looked at the final line again. I wish you've forgiven me for trying. Maybe that was his way of asking permission to let go. Or maybe it was mine. I tied the letters back together, placed them gently in the box, and slid it beneath the bed once more. The rain had stopped. The house was still. I lay down beside Peter and stared at the ceiling, the faint scent of cedar and ink still clinging to my hands. Somewhere in the quiet, I thought I heard Alan's voice, not speaking, not pleading, just breathing with the rhythm of the rain that had finally ended. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel haunted. I just felt human. The chapel smelled faintly of salt and lilies. The sea was only 100 yards away, its low murmur slipping through the old wooden doors like a secret. Morning light sifted in through the stained glass, dust turning in the beams like slow snow. The florist was humming to herself, setting white blooms into small glass vases. Baby's breath, lilies, a few sprigs of eucalyptus. The scent was soft, almost hesitant, like it knew it didn't belong here yet. I stood near the front pew, watching her work. Peter was in the back, talking with the pastor, his voice a gentle baritone that blended with the rustle of the waves outside. He looked handsome there, steady, kind, a little awkward in the way good men sometimes are. When he caught my eye, he smiled. I smiled back. But even from across the room, I could see something flicker behind it. Worry, maybe? Or doubt. The rehearsal began. The florist paused, the pastor cleared his throat, and I took my cue. Heels against the wooden floor one step, then another. The sound echoed, hollow and lonely. I tried to picture the pews full, the air alive with laughter, with my children whispering in the back, pretending not to be emotional. But all I saw were empty seats, and sunlight spilling where their faces should have been. Halfway down the aisle, I stopped. Peter tilted his head. You okay? I nodded, just catching my breath. He smiled again, but softer this time, his eyes searching mine for something I couldn't name. It'll feel different on the day, he said. There'll be music, people, warmth. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to imagine the day as he saw it full of joy instead of absences. But even now, the silence in the chapel seemed louder than anything the organ could play. Afterward, the florist handed me a small bouquet to practice with. "Hold it close," she said, "like you're keeping it safe." Her hands were warm, her smile kind. She didn't know she'd just told me the truth of my whole life. That night, after Peter kissed me goodnight and turned off his bedside lamp, I lay awake. The rehearsal had left something unsettled in me. Every step I took down that aisle felt like walking through the ghosts of my own choices, each echo a question I never answered. I dreamed I was in the chapel again, but this time, I wasn't alone. 2 sets of footsteps beside me, one steady, one fading. I didn't turn to see their faces. I didn't need to. I knew one belonged to Peter, and the other, to Alan. The sound of them together was strange, like 2 lives brushing past each other but never meeting. I woke just before dawn, my heart caught somewhere between relief and ache. The room was still gray with early light. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, the screen lighting up my face. One message, from Alan, "I'd like to come. Not to ruin it to walk you down the aisle." I stared at the words until they blurred. The sea was louder now, the tide creeping close against the rocks. I imagined Alan's voice saying those words lower than I remembered, quieter, worn down by the years between us. I sat up, pulling the blanket around my shoulders. The room smelled faintly of rain and salt, or maybe that was just memory. He wanted to walk me down the aisle, the man who once watched me walk away. I thought of the letters I'd read his handwriting, uneven but honest. Maybe this was his final apology, or his way of asking to be part of something he'd broken long ago. Maybe he just wanted to see me happy, one last time. The phone was still in my hand. I could have replied. I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I looked out the window. The horizon was just beginning to pale, a thin silver line above the water. Birds skimmed the surface, wings catching the early light. For the first time in years, I felt something shift, not joy, not sadness, but a fragile kind of peace. Like the tide turning, quietly, without permission. Still, beneath it, a question I couldn't shake. If I let him walk me down that aisle, would it be forgiveness or surrender? The morning moved slowly. Peter woke, kissed my shoulder, and asked if I slept well. I said yes. He didn't press further. He never did. When he left for his morning walk, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd written the invitations weeks ago, the same table where I'd whispered to no one, "Let's see who loves me enough to show up." Now, I had my answer, just not the one I'd expected. Outside, the sea was calm. The kettle began to whistle, and on the counter beside it, my phone lit up again, Alan's name glowing quietly against the screen. This time, I didn't look away. The phone rang just after noon. I was standing by the window, folding a dish towel, when I heard it, that soft, uncertain ring that seems to hesitate before asking to be answered. Peter had gone into town to pick up the rings. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the low pulse of the tide outside. When I saw Matthew's name on the screen, my hands went still. It had been months since we'd spoken real words, not the polite messages passed through his sister. For a moment, I just stood there, the sound of the sea filling the silence between the rings. Then I picked up. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice came through sharp, breathless, like he'd been rehearsing what to say. "Don't call me that," he said. Not after what I just heard. I sat down slowly at the table, the same one I'd written my invitations on. The wood felt colder than usual beneath my palm. "What did you hear?" I asked. "That you're marrying him. That you're letting Alan walk you down the aisle." His words cut through the room like a crack in glass. For a heartbeat, I couldn't answer. I could hear the sound of cars in the distance, the faint echo of the tide, everything but my own voice. "Matthew," I began, but he interrupted. "You don't know this man, Mom. You've known him, what, a year? Maybe less? And now you're dragging Dad into it too, after everything?" The anger in his voice wasn't new. I'd heard it before, when he was 16 and the world had stopped making sense for him. But now, it wasn't just anger. It was fear. "I'm not dragging anyone," I said quietly. Alan offered. I didn't ask. He laughed, short and bitter. "That's worse." I closed my eyes, pressing my thumb into the edge of the table. "You think I don't know how this looks?" I said. "You think I don't think about it every day?" He went quiet for a moment. "The kind of silence that feels like someone walking away. I just don't get it," he said finally, his voice low. "Why him?" "Why now?" "Because he's kind. Because he listens. Because he looks at me like I still have a whole life left to live." But none of those things felt like enough to say out loud. "Because I'm still here," I said instead. "And I want to live what's left with someone who sees me." He didn't reply. I could hear him breathing, steady but heavy, like he was trying not to break. "You always talk about forgiveness," he said finally. But you never forgave us for choosing Dad. That one landed deep. I felt it settle somewhere in my chest beneath the ribs. That's not true, I whispered, isn't it? And then the soft final sound of the line going dead. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand. Outside, the waves were crawling slowly toward the rocks, the same way they always did, patient, relentless. Every decision has a price. I knew that, but somehow, hearing my son's voice tremble on the other end made it real in a way it hadn't been before. I set the phone down and walked to the window. The sky was beginning to gray over, the kind of light that makes everything look softer, lonelier. I could see Peter in the distance, walking up the path from the driveway, a small paper bag in his hands. He waved when he saw me, his smile quiet and certain, and for a moment, I envied him that certainty, the way he could love without looking backward. I pressed my hand to the glass. My reflection stared back at me, tired eyes, a faint line of lipstick still on my mouth from this morning, hair falling loose from its pins. A woman caught between two lives. When Peter came inside, he placed the bag on the counter and kissed my cheek. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. Matthew called. He waited. And I took a slow breath. "He's not coming." Peter's eyes softened. "He didn't ask for details. He just reached for my hand, warm and steady." "Then we'll keep a seat for him anyway," he said. I smiled, but it felt small, fragile. There was kindness in his words, but also an ache, the kind that comes when love starts to cost something you can't measure. That night, after dinner, I walked down to the edge of the water. The tide had receded, leaving thin ribbons of foam across the sand. I took off my shoes and stepped in, letting the cold sting my ankles. The horizon was faint, almost invisible. I thought of Matthew as a boy building sandcastles here with his sister, running from the waves that chased him up the shore. His laughter had once filled this place. Now it was just the wind and the slow breath of the sea. I whispered his name to the waves, though I knew they couldn't carry it far enough. When I turned back, the porch light from the house flickered against the dark. A promise, a reminder, a question. I stood there until the chill began to creep up my legs. Every decision has a price, I thought again. But maybe, if you're lucky, it also buys you the chance to begin again, even if it means walking into that chance alone. The water lapped softly at my feet, and somewhere behind me, through the open window, I heard Peter humming a tune I didn't recognize, but one that felt like home. The gown hung against the mirror like it was waiting for someone else. Cream lace, soft and quiet, with a faint shimmer that caught the afternoon light. The seamstress, a woman with silver hair pinned neatly at her nape, was humming under her breath as she adjusted the fabric around my waist. "Hold still," she said gently. "You've changed since the first fitting." I smiled faintly. "I suppose we all have." The shop smelled of rain and pressed linen. Outside, clouds gathered over the coastal street, the kind of gray that makes everything look like an old photograph. A kettle whistled faintly in the back room, the sound fading into the steady rhythm of pins being tucked, hem measured, lace smoothed flat. I looked at my reflection, the gown's neckline soft against my collarbones, the sleeves brushing my wrists. For a moment, I didn't recognize the woman standing there. Her eyes were gentler than I remembered, her shoulders less guarded, and beneath all that, something fragile, a kind of hope that scared me more than sorrow ever had. "Beautiful," the seamstress murmured, stepping back. "It suits you," I wanted to believe her. But beauty at my age feels different, quieter, less about how you look, and more about what you've survived. I ran my fingers down the fabric, feeling the tiny stitches, each one perfect, patient, deliberate. In the mirror, I caught my own smile small, almost shy. It startled me. It had been so long since joy had found its way to my face without asking permission. But just as quickly, something inside me shifted. The smile faltered, because behind the reflection, behind the careful lace and the soft light, I saw the ghosts, the ones who wouldn't be there to see me wear this. Claire's quiet disappointment, Matthew's silence, and Alan's words still echoing from that message, "I'd like to walk you down the aisle." The seamstress noticed my shoulders drop. "Too tight?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, it fits fine." She gave me a kind look but didn't press. Years in that little shop had probably taught her when not to ask. When she stepped away to fetch her measuring tape, I looked back at the mirror. For a moment, I placed my hand over my heart, half expecting to feel the same rhythm that had carried me through so many beginnings and endings. But it was slower now, steadier, quieter. I whispered to the reflection, "You made it." Not a celebration, just acknowledgement. Because the truth was standing there in that gown, I felt both halves of my life touching. The woman who once walked away from a marriage that had broken her, and the woman who was brave enough to walk toward love again. They were both me. And for the first time, they didn't feel like strangers. When the seamstress returned, she helped me step off the platform and unzip the dress. The fabric sighed as it came loose, like it, too, was relieved to rest. "You'll pick it up Friday?" she asked. "Yes," I said. Friday. I changed back into my clothes' soft wool trousers, a cardigan too thin for the weather, and glanced at the gown one last time before she wrapped it in tissue. It hung there, weightless, as if it could remember a younger woman, but wasn't waiting for her return. Outside, the rain had started. Not the hard kind, just a quiet drizzle, slow enough that the world didn't hurry to escape it. I walked to my car under a pale gray sky, the air damp and clean. Through the shop window, my reflection followed me faint, distorted by the glass and the rain that blurred its edges. For a second, I imagined what my daughter might say if she saw me like this. Would she recognize me? Would she think I'd forgotten what came before the years of holding everything together alone? The nights spent wondering if love was something I'd already used up? I pressed a hand against the car door, feeling the cool metal beneath my palm. Love, I thought, isn't about starting over. It's about forgiving what remains. Forgiving the woman in the mirror who stayed too long, and the one who left too late. Forgiving the people who didn't show up, and the ones who finally did. Forgiving the version of myself, who once believed happiness had an expiration date. I sat in the car as the rain thickened, turning the windshield into a moving watercolor of gray and silver. People passed by under umbrellas, strangers, each carrying their own small story. The dress lay across the back seat, wrapped carefully in its tissue paper cocoon. I thought of how it would feel to wear it on that day, to walk down the aisle with everyone watching, or no one at all. I turned the key, and the engine shuddered awake. Through the glass, the world softened the outlines of buildings, the curve of the street, even my own reflection fading into something quieter, something almost kind. And as I pulled away from the curb, the thought settled over me like the rain. Maybe love doesn't ask to be perfect. Maybe it just asks to be brave. The day began in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your chest, heavy and expectant. The church stood on the edge of the sea road, its stone walls pale against a washed-out sky. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and wax, of wood polished too carefully. Evelyn paused at the entrance, the hem of her gown brushing against the tiled floor. The morning light filtered through the stained glass in fractured colors, blues, ambers, muted reds that fell across her face like quiet confessions. Peter stood at the altar, his hands folded in front of him. He looked smaller than she remembered, his tux slightly wrinkled, a man doing his best to contain both joy and fear in the same breath. When he saw her, he smiled, not the kind of smile that demands a response, but one that simply waited for her to reach him. But she couldn't move. Not yet. Her eyes swept the pews, tracing the neat rows of empty seats. The floral ribbons swayed slightly with the draft that slipped through the open doors. There were faces, kind ones, polite ones, but none she knew deeply, none that had been part of her life before this new chapter began. The spaces where her children should have sat yawned like wounds she had tried too long to cover. Claire's laughter, Matthew's quiet teasing, all replaced by silence so loud it almost hummed. She tried to steady her breath, but it caught halfway through, trembling like a cord plucked too hard. She had told herself for weeks that it was enough that love didn't need an audience, that peace was private. But standing there, in the sacred quiet of that chapel, she felt the ache of absence more than ever. Peter took a tentative step forward, his expression softening. "You look beautiful," he whispered, though the words barely carried through the distance between them. She wanted to answer, to walk down that aisle and close the gap, but her feet stayed rooted to the floor. It wasn't hesitation. It was memory, the weight of years that lingered in this moment like ghosts refusing to leave. Behind her, the doors creaked, just once slow, deliberate. The sound broke the stillness like a breath after too long underwater. Every head turned slightly. Footsteps followed. Steady, familiar, Evelyn. Didn't turn immediately. She knew that rhythm. Measured, patient. The sound of someone who had nothing left to prove. Peter's gaze lifted, his brows tightening, confusion flickering across his face, and then Evelyn turned. There, framed by the open doors and the pale light spilling in from outside, stood Alan. He wasn't dressed like a groom, or even a guest, just a man in a simple dark suit, his hair silver at the edges, a quiet steadiness in his posture. For a heartbeat, everything in the church stopped moving. He met her eyes, no apology, no explanation. Just a kind of understanding that didn't need words. And suddenly, she wasn't sure if the tears that gathered in her eyes were for the years lost between them, or for the strange grace of this moment that after everything, he still came. Alan took a slow step forward. The congregation turned to watch, whispers caught in their throats. Evelyn's heart pounded not with fear, but with something older, something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, maybe. Closure or the shape of it. He stopped just a few feet away, offering his arm without a word. The air between them was heavy with everything unspoken the years. The blame, the regret that had softened with time. Evelyn looked toward the altar again. Peter was watching, uncertain, but patient. The world seemed to hold its breath. She turned back to Alan. For a moment, she thought she saw the younger man in him, the one who had once made her laugh so hard she forgot herself, the one who couldn't love her right, but loved her still. Her fingers trembled as she reached for his arm. The music began, soft and slow, a fragile melody that barely reached the back pews, and as they began to walk step by step down that long, echoing aisle, she felt the past and present fold into one another, not fighting anymore, just coexisting. Each footstep echoed through the empty pews, filling them with something new, not the absence of her children, but the presence of something she hadn't expected to find again, forgiveness. At the halfway mark, she glanced up toward Peter, who nodded gently, his eyes glistening. He understood that this wasn't about choosing one love over another. It was about walking through every version of herself to reach the one that was finally whole. By the time she reached the altar, her tears had dried. The sunlight broke through the glass just then, scattering soft gold across the floor. And as she took her place beside Peter, Alan stepped back quietly, a shadow retreating into the light. The music faded. The silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel empty, only full in the quietest, most human way possible. He stood there, still as the altar candles, as if time had been waiting for this moment to finish its sentence. Alan older now, lines carved deep at the corners of his eyes, his posture less certain but still proud in that quiet, stubborn way she remembered. The years hadn't been kind, but they hadn't taken everything. His presence still filled a room, not through volume but gravity. He didn't ask. He simply extended his arm, a gesture as simple as breath, but it carried the weight of an entire lifetime between them. For a moment, Evelyn couldn't move. The chapel blurred at the edges, the lilies, the guests, the distant hum of the organ all dissolving into a kind of muted haze. The only clear thing left was him. His hand waited, steady, not pleading, not demanding, just waiting. And she, the woman who had spent decades teaching herself how to stand alone, felt her fingers tremble. Not from fear, but from recognition. There are some touches the body remembers long after the heart forgets. When she finally placed her hand in his, the warmth was immediate, startling. The chapel inhaled as one, a collective breath suspended in reverence or disbelief. Evelyn didn't look at anyone. She couldn't. The world narrowed to sound the slow rhythm of footsteps against the wooden aisle. Hers, light and deliberate. His, slower, uneven. Together they made a music that felt older than both of them. The scent of his aftershave drifted toward her cedar and rain. The same one he'd worn the night he left. The same one she'd sworn she'd never forget. It lingered like an echo from another life, one that still pulsed quietly beneath the years of distance. She dared to glance sideways. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were soft, not with nostalgia, but with understanding. There was something fragile there, something she hadn't seen in him before. Humility. Halfway down the aisle, she felt her breath steady. The weight of grief, anger, and longing, all the invisible things she had carried for years, began to loosen. Each step forward felt like forgiveness unfolding under her feet. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was walking toward an ending. She was simply walking through memory, through regret, through love that had refused to die, even after it changed its shape. The guests faded. The music softened. The air was thick with quiet awe. When they reached the front, Alan didn't look at Peter. He didn't need to. He just turned to Evelyn and whispered, barely above breath, "You look happy." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say thank you. She wanted to say I'm sorry. She wanted to say you should have been here sooner. But all she managed was a small nod, her lips trembling in the space between words and silence. He gave her hand a final squeeze brief. Sure, then let go. The loss of his touch was instant, like stepping from warmth into air. Evelyn turned toward Peter, who was already smiling, patient, gentle, unthreatened. His eyes said what he didn't voice. Go on. It's all right. She took her place beside him, her heart steady for the first time that morning. The priest's voice rose, quiet and calm, filling the room again. Behind her, Alan moved to the last pew, sitting alone in the far corner. Evelyn didn't look back, but she didn't need to. She could feel him there, not haunting her past, but witnessing her peace. And in that stillness, something broke softly inside her, not in pain, but in release. For the first time, she felt whole. Not because everything was fixed, but because some things, she realized, didn't need fixing, only understanding. Peter's voice was steady, the kind of steady that comes from choosing your words 100 times before you ever speak them aloud. The chapel had grown still, as though the rain outside was holding its breath too. Every drop against the glass sounded like a heartbeat. Evelyn stood across from him, hands folded around the small bouquet of white lilies. The scent was faint but grounding. She could feel her pulse in her palms, in her throat, in the hollow between her ribs. Peter's eyes didn't waver. He looked at her like a man who had waited his whole life for a moment that didn't need to be perfect, just real. "I don't promise to never make mistakes," he said softly, "but I promise to always stay when they happen." A few quiet smiles rippled through the small crowd. The words weren't polished. They were honest. Evelyn tried to listen truly, but her gaze drifted, past the altar, past the window streaked with rain, to the front pew on the left where Alan sat, hands clasped, head slightly bowed. He looked different from the man she once married, smaller somehow, but lighter. Pride flickered across his face, not the proud kind that insists on being seen, but the quiet kind that comes when something broken finally finds its shape again. For a fleeting second, she imagined what he must be thinking, how strange it must feel to walk your ex-wife down the aisle to another man. But there was no bitterness in his expression, only peace, maybe even relief, and that was when it struck her this ceremony, this day, wasn't about rewriting history. It was about acknowledging it. Every chapter, even the painful ones, had carried her here. Peter reached for her hand. His was warm and sure, the opposite of Alan's, yet somehow both touches lived in her memory without conflict. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of years settle into stillness. When it was her turn to speak, her voice faltered on the first word. She stopped, smiling faintly. "I thought I was too old for this." A soft laugh fluttered through the room. "But maybe love doesn't age," she continued. "It just learns how to listen." Her eyes met Peter's again. "I promise to love you without fear this time. To let the light in, even when I think I don't deserve it. And to stay not out of duty, but out of choice." The priest nodded gently, as if blessing more than the vows. Outside, the rain deepened, not angry, but full, steady, alive. It rolled down the glass like applause from the sky. Evelyn could almost feel it on her skin, the coolness, the cleansing. When the rings were exchanged, Peter whispered something she couldn't quite hear, but she caught the look in his eyes, the promise beneath the words. When she turned to face the room, her breath hitched just once. The pews were still half empty. The spaces where her children should have been were still there, open, waiting. But something inside her had shifted. She didn't feel the ache anymore, not the way she used to. Instead, she felt gratitude for every person who had chosen to show up, and for those who hadn't, too. Because absence, she realized, is just another kind of presence. Alan caught her gaze for a moment. He smiled small, almost imperceptible, and she returned it. Then she looked at Peter, at the life waiting before her. The rain fell harder. The organ began to play, and somewhere within her chest, peace finally found its voice. She wasn't looking for anyone anymore. She was already found.